The bitter cold of the Wyoming Territory, 1878, bit through Rosalie Harrington's tattered dress as she crawled across the dusty trail. Blood trickled from her split lip, mixing with tears that carved clean paths down her dirt-streaked face. The stagecoach that had brought her west her hope for a new beginning had disappeared over the horizon, along with the man who'd promised her marriage but delivered only betrayal and violence. Rosalie's trembling fingers clutched at the rocky soil. She had barely escaped with her life after discovering Edward Clayton's true nature, not the respectable businessman he'd claimed to be in his letters, but a notorious gambler with debts to dangerous men. When she'd confronted him, his response had been swift and brutal. Then he'd thrown her from the moving stagecoach like discarded baggage, 20 miles from the nearest town. The sun beat down mercilessly as she tried to rise, only to collapse again from exhaustion and pain. Her ribs ached with each breath, and the bruises forming on her arms and face throbbed in time with her pulse. The distant sound of hoofbeats barely registered through her haze of pain and despair. Javier Matthews pulled back on the reins of his stallion, Thunderbolt, as he spotted something unusual on the trail ahead. The lone figure stirred weakly in a cloud of dust. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached cautiously. The Wyoming Territory had taught him to expect trouble from any unexpected encounter. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured to his horse as they drew closer. What he saw made his blood run cold. A woman, badly beaten, her once fine dress torn and filthy, her red gold hair tumbled around shoulders that shook with silent sobs. Javier dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. "Madam," he called softly. "Are you hurt?" Rosalie's head jerked up, her green eyes wide with terror. She tried to scramble backward, raising her hands defensively. "Don't worry, I won't harm you," Javier said, crouching down but keeping a respectful distance. His dark eyes were kind beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Dirt streaked his tanned face, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, but there was something reassuring in his steady gaze. "Please," Rosalie whispered hoarsely, "just leave me be." "Can't do that, madam, not in good conscience." Javier assessed her injuries with a practiced eye. "Whoever did this to you could still be around. You need help." A sob escaped her. "He's gone, threw me from the stagecoach and left me to die." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "May I approach? I've got water in my canteen." At her slight nod, he moved closer, uncorking the canteen and offering it to her. Rosalie drank greedily, water spilling down her chin in her desperation to soothe her parched throat. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. Javier nodded, his eyes taking in her injuries. "I don't think anything's broken, but you're in no condition to walk." He glanced at the horizon. "Night's coming. We need to get you somewhere safe." Fear flickered across her face. "I don't even know who you are." "Javier Matthews, madam. I run a small ranch about 5 miles east of here." He gestured to the badge pinned to his vest. "Deputy in Silver Creek when they need me, and you are—" "Rosalie Harrington," she replied hesitantly. "I was traveling to Silver Creek to be married." Her voice broke on the last word. Xavier's expression darkened. "To the man who did this." She nodded, tears threatening again. "Well, Miss Harrington, I reckon that man just forfeited any right to your company." Javier stood and offered his hand. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to take you somewhere safe where you can rest and heal." Rosalie hesitated, weighing her limited options. She could stay and likely die from exposure, or trust this stranger, this cowboy with kind eyes and a deputy's badge. "I have no money to pay you," she admitted. "Wasn't asking for any." Xavier's smile was slight but genuine, just trying to do right. After a long moment, Rosalie nodded and extended her trembling hand. Javier helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness for such a weathered-looking man. When she swayed dizzily, he steadied her with a strong arm. "You're in no condition to walk," he observed. Without further discussion, he scooped her up as carefully as if she were made of porcelain and carried her to his horse. With practiced ease, Javier lifted her onto his saddle, then mounted behind her. As he settled her securely against his chest, he spoke softly near her ear. "You're safe now, Miss Harrington. I give you my word." Something in his voice, absolute certainty, perhaps made Rosalie believe him. As the horse began to move, she allowed herself to lean against his solid warmth, too exhausted to maintain her guard any longer. Xavier kept Thunderbolt at a gentle pace, mindful of his injured passenger. The mountains loomed purple against the darkening sky as they headed east, away from the main trail and toward his homestead. "Not much farther," he assured her as she winced at a particularly jarring step. "My place isn't fancy, but it's warm and dry." "Why are you helping me?" Rosalie asked, her voice barely audible above the rhythm of hoofbeats. Xavier was silent for a moment. "My mother always said that the measure of a man is how he treats those who can't offer him anything in return." He adjusted his hold to make her more comfortable. "Besides, leaving a lady in distress isn't the way we do things out here." As the sun sank behind the mountains, they crested a small rise, and Xavier's ranch came into view, a modest cabin with a barn and corral, nestled in a protected valley with a creek running alongside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a few cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. "Someone's there," Rosalie observed nervously. "That'll be Mrs. Wilkins," Xavier explained. "Widow who helps out around the place. She comes by to cook and clean a few times a week." He glanced down at Rosalie. "You'll be glad of her presence, I expect, propriety and all." Relief washed over Rosalie's features. A respectable woman's presence would certainly make this situation less awkward. As they approached, the cabin door swung open, and a stout woman with iron gray hair stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Javier Matthews, you're late for supper again." Mrs. Wilkins's scolding died on her lips as she took in the scene before her. "Lord above, what happened?" Xavier dismounted smoothly, then reached up to help Rosalie down. "Mrs. Wilkins, this is Miss Harrington. She's had some trouble on the road and needs our help." The older woman's kind face creased with concern as she hurried forward. "You poor dear, come inside at once. I've got stew on the stove and the spare room made up." With Xavier supporting her on one side and Mrs. Wilkins fussing on the other, Rosalie was ushered into the warm cabin. The interior was simple but comfortable, a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books that seemed at odds with Xavier's rugged appearance. "Sit her here by the fire," Mrs. Wilkins directed. "I'll fetch some clean water and bandages." Xavier eased Rosalie into a chair, then stepped back, suddenly awkward. "I'll see to my horse," he said, turning toward the door. "You're in good hands with Mrs. Wilkins. She raised 8 children and knows more about healing than the doctor in town." As he reached for the door handle, Rosalie called after him, "Mr. Matthews." When he turned, she met his eyes steadily for the first time. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Get some rest, Miss Harrington. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning." After he left, Mrs. Wilkins returned with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a small jar of salve that smelled of herbs. "That man," the older woman said as she gently cleaned Rosalie's injuries, "has the kindest heart in 3 counties, though he'd never admit it. Found me half frozen in a blizzard 2 winters back after my Henry died. Gave me work when no one else would hire a woman my age." She clucked her tongue at a particularly nasty bruise on Rosalie's cheek. "Whoever did this to you deserves a special place in hell." "I was a fool," Rosalie whispered, wincing as the cloth touched her split lip. "I came west to marry a man I'd only known through letters. Edward Clayton. He seemed so respectable on paper." Mrs. Wilkins's eyes widened. "Clayton, the gambler," she shook her head. "Oh, child. You're not the first young woman he's lured out here with promises, but you might be the first to escape with your life." Rosalie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The older woman hesitated. "Perhaps this isn't the time." "Please," Rosalie insisted. "I need to know what I escaped, Mrs." Wilkins sighed heavily. "There have been rumors about Clayton for years. 2 women came to marry him. Neither was seen again after the first week. He claimed they'd changed their minds and gone back east, but no one believed him." She patted Rosalie's hand. "The law could never prove anything, but folks know." "You're lucky, my dear, very lucky indeed." Rosalie shivered despite the warmth of the fire. How naive she had been, believing Edward's charming letters and promises of a comfortable life as a merchant's wife. The reality had been so different: his cruel eyes, his drinking, and finally, his fists when she'd questioned the gambling debts she'd overheard mentioned. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Wilkins asked gently. Rosalie stared into the fire, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had spent nearly every penny on the journey west. Her family back in Boston had made it clear there would be no returning after she'd stubbornly insisted on this marriage against their wishes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no money, no family who will help me, and nowhere to go." Mrs. Wilkins finished applying the salve and began bandaging a particularly deep cut on Rosalie's forearm. "Well, you're welcome here until you're healed. Xavier won't mind. And Silver Creek always needs teachers if you've any education." "I taught at a girls' school in Boston for 3 years," Rosalie replied, hope flickering faintly. "Then there's your answer," Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. "But first you need food and rest." She stood with a grunt. "Let's get you into some clean clothes. I keep some spares here for when I stay overnight. They'll be too large, but they'll do until we can wash yours." Later, dressed in a borrowed nightgown and wrapped in a quilt, Rosalie sat at the table with a bowl of hearty beef stew before her. Xavier had returned from tending his horse, his tall frame filling the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside, removing his hat. "Feeling any better, Miss Harrington?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Yes, thank you," she replied. "Mrs. Wilkins has been very kind." "Best cook and healer in the territory," Xavier said with a slight smile toward the older woman, who waved away the compliment as she placed a bowl of stew before him. "Miss Harrington was a teacher back east," Mrs. Wilkins informed him as they ate. "I was telling her Silver Creek might have need of her skills once she's recovered." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Town's growing, lots of families moving in now that the railroad's coming through. School board was just saying they need another teacher." He glanced at Rosalie. "You're welcome to stay here until you're well enough to decide what you want to do." "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," he interrupted gently. "I've got the room and Mrs. Wilkins is here most days." "Javier Matthews, always collecting strays," Mrs. Wilkins said with fond exasperation. "First that half-wild stallion no one could ride, then me, now Miss Harrington here." A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "Thunderbolt turned out to be the finest horse I've ever owned, and you make the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi. I'd say my judgment is sound." Rosalie couldn't help but smile at the easy banter between them. For the first time since the nightmare with Edward began, she felt safe. The following days passed in a haze of recovery. Rosalie slept more than she'd ever slept before, her body demanding rest to heal from both physical and emotional wounds. When she was awake, Mrs. Wilkins tended to her injuries and kept her company with stories of her 8 children, now scattered across the Western Territories. Xavier was often away during daylight hours, tending to his small herd of cattle or riding into Silver Creek for his deputy duties. But in the evenings, he would sit by the fire and read aloud from one of his many books, Dickens, Twain, even Shakespeare, his deep voice bringing the words to life in a way that surprised and delighted Rosalie. "You're an educated man, Mr. Matthews," she observed one evening after he finished a passage from The Merchant of Venice. He closed the book, his fingers trailing along its worn spine. "My father believed in education, taught at a college back east before consumption took him. My mother and I came west afterward, tried to keep his books with us through all the moves." His eyes grew distant. "Lost her to a fever when I was 17. The books are what I have left of them both." "I'm sorry," Rosalie said softly. "It must have been difficult being alone so young." Xavier nodded, his gaze returning to her. "Life teaches you to be self-sufficient out here, but there are moments when a book can be good company." He paused. "What brought you to teaching, Miss Harrington?" "My father was a professor as well at a small college in Massachusetts," she explained. "He believed daughters should be educated just as sons are. When he died, my mother remarried a man who didn't share that view. Teaching was my way to support myself and maintain some independence." And yet you gave it up to marry a stranger, Xavier observed, though his tone held no judgment. Rosalie sighed. My stepfather arranged a marriage for me to a business associate, a man 40 years my senior. Edward's letters offered an escape. He presented himself as educated, cultured, respectful of a woman's mind. Her hands twisted in her lap. I was so desperate to avoid one bad marriage that I nearly walked into something much worse. Some men aren't what they seem, Xavier agreed. Out here, you learn to judge people by their actions, not their words. A lesson I've learned too late, Rosalie said ruefully. Xavier leaned forward, his dark eyes intent. No, you survived. That means it's exactly the right time to have learned it. His words stayed with Rosalie long after she'd retired to the small guest room. For the first time, she began to think of her ordeal not as a shameful failure, but as an escape, a narrow one perhaps, but an escape nonetheless. And with that subtle shift in perspective came the first genuine seeds of hope for her future. By the end of her first week at the ranch, Rosalie was strong enough to move around the cabin unassisted. The bruises on her face had faded from angry purple to yellowing green, and her split lip had begun to heal. She insisted on helping Mrs. Wilkins with the cooking and cleaning, grateful to feel useful again. It was while hanging laundry in the yard that Rosalie first noticed the small garden plot behind the cabin, overgrown with weeds, but clearly once tended with care. That was Xavier's mother's garden, Mrs. Wilkins explained when she asked about it. He keeps meaning to plant it again but never finds the time, says he doesn't have his mother's touch with growing things. Rosalie studied the neglected plot thoughtfully. My mother kept a garden. She taught me a great deal about herbs and vegetables. The next morning, armed with borrowed gloves and tools, Rosalie began the task of reclaiming the garden from the weeds. The physical labor was therapeutic, giving her a focus beyond her troubles and a way to repay Xavier's kindness. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear his approach until his shadow fell across the freshly turned soil. Rosalie looked up, squinting against the sun, to find Xavier watching her with an unreadable expression. I hope you don't mind, she said, suddenly uncertain. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned this was your mother's garden. I don't mind, he replied quietly. He crouched down beside her, running his fingers through the dark soil she'd loosened. She would have hated seeing it so neglected. Used to grow herbs for her remedies here, vegetables for the table. I found some mint and sage still struggling through, Rosalie told him, pointing to the hardier plants that had survived. And the rosemary is thriving despite the weeds, I thought perhaps. Well, I could try to bring it back while I'm here, as a small way to thank you. Xavier's eyes met hers, something warm and appreciative in their depths. I'd like that, Miss Harrington. Rosalie, she corrected him impulsively. After everything, it seems silly to stand on formality. Rosalie, he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. Then you must call me Xavier. The moment stretched between them, fragile and new, then he cleared his throat and stood. I'm heading into town tomorrow. The school board is meeting. If you're feeling strong enough, you might want to come along, meet them. Rosalie's heart beat faster at the thought of taking this first step toward rebuilding her life. Yes, she said decisively, I'd like that very much. Silver Creek was larger than Rosalie had expected, a proper town with wooden sidewalks, a church with a white steeple, a red brick schoolhouse, and even a small hotel with glass windows. As Xavier helped her down from his wagon, she felt the curious stares of passers-by. Word travels fast in small towns, Xavier murmured, noticing her discomfort. Mrs. Wilkins has probably told the whole story to half the women in Silver Creek by now. Wonderful, Rosalie said with a nervous laugh. I'm to be the subject of gossip before I've even introduced myself. If it's any consolation, you're hardly the most interesting gossip at the moment. Xavier guided her toward the town hall. The railroad coming through has everyone in a state, and the banker's wife just ran off with a traveling salesman. Despite her nervousness, Rosalie found herself smiling. I suppose that does make my situation seem rather tame by comparison. The school board consisted of 5 members: the mayor, the town doctor, the minister, and 2 prominent citizens. They received Rosalie warmly, impressed by her education and previous experience. By the end of the meeting, she had been offered a position teaching the younger children, starting as soon as she felt well enough. The position comes with a small room at the back of the schoolhouse, Mayor Thornton explained. It's modest but private. Previous teachers have found it adequate. That sounds perfect, Rosalie replied, relief flooding through her at the prospect of independence. I can start next week if that suits. As they left the town hall, Xavier seemed unusually quiet. Is everything all right? Rosalie asked as they walked toward the general store. Of course, he replied, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm glad the school board recognized your qualifications. The children will be fortunate to have you as their teacher. Rosalie sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but before she could press further, a commotion from the saloon across the street caught their attention. A man staggered out, clearly drunk despite the early hour, shouting obscenities at someone inside. Xavier stiffened beside her. Wait here, he said tersely, his hand moving to the deputy's badge pinned to his vest. But as the drunk man turned, Rosalie gasped, instinctively stepping behind Xavier. It was Edward Clayton, his face flushed with alcohol, his once fine clothes rumpled and stained. Problem Clayton. Xavier called, his voice hard as he positioned himself protectively in front of Rosalie. Edward squinted at them, recognition dawning slowly in his bloodshot eyes. Well, if it isn't Deputy Matthews. His gaze shifted to Rosalie and a cruel smile spread across his face. And my runaway bride. I wondered where you'd scurried off to after your little tumble from the coach. Xavier's hand moved to his gun. Miss Harrington is under my protection now. You do well to remember that. Edward laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Protection? Is that what they're calling it these days? Tell me, Deputy, are you enjoying my leavings? Several bystanders gasped at the crude implication. Xavier took a step forward, his expression dangerous, but Rosalie placed a restraining hand on his arm. He's not worth it, she said quietly. Then, drawing herself up to her full height, she addressed Edward directly. You are a liar, a gambler, and a coward who beats women. I thank God every day that I escaped you. Any man in this town would be a better husband than you could ever be. Edward's face contorted with rage. He lurched forward, but before he could reach them, two men from the saloon grabbed his arms. That's enough, Clayton, one said firmly. You've been barred for not paying your tab and now you're harassing a lady. Time for you to leave town. I'm not going anywhere. Edward snarled, struggling against their hold. That woman belongs to me. We had an agreement based on lies, Rosalie replied steadily. You presented yourself as a respectable merchant, not a drunken gambler who abuses women. Any agreement between us was void the moment you showed your true character. A crowd had gathered now, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. The sheriff pushed through, a stocky man with a handlebar mustache. What's the trouble, Matthews? He asked Xavier. This is Edward Clayton, Sheriff, Xavier replied. The man I told you about, the one who beat Miss Harrington and threw her from a moving stage coach. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he assessed Edward. That's so? Well, we take a dim view of men who hurt women in this town. He gestured to two deputies who had followed him. Take Mr. Clayton to the jail. He can sober up there while I decide what charges to file. As they dragged a protesting Edward away, the sheriff turned to Rosalie. I'm sorry about that, madam. Been hearing rumors about Clayton for years, but never had enough evidence to act. If you're willing to make a formal statement, we might finally be able to keep him locked up for a good long while. Rosalie nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Yes, I'll do that. There may be other women he's harmed. They deserve justice. Xavier placed a supportive hand on the small of her back. I'll bring her to your office tomorrow, Sheriff. She's had enough excitement for one day. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Rosalie lost in thought about the confrontation with Edward. It had been terrifying to see him again, but standing up to him had also been oddly liberating. She was no longer the frightened woman who had crawled in the dust of the trail, but someone who could face her abuser and speak the truth about him. You were brave today, Xavier said as they approached the ranch. Not many would confront a man like Clayton so directly. I was terrified, Rosalie admitted, but I couldn't let him think he still had power over me. Xavier nodded approvingly. That's what real courage is, feeling the fear but acting anyway. He helped her down from the wagon when they reached the cabin. Clayton won't trouble you again. I'll make sure of it. Thank you. Rosalie hesitated, then added softly, for everything. That night, after Mrs. Wilkins had gone home and Xavier was tending to the animals in the barn, Rosalie sat by the fire, reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a week. The teaching position offered a path to independence she hadn't dared hope for after her ordeal. Yet as she thought about moving to the small room behind the schoolhouse, she felt an unexpected pang of regret. She'd grown accustomed to this cozy cabin, to Mrs. Wilkins's motherly fussing, and to Xavier's quiet, steady presence. The way he read aloud in the evenings, the respect with which he treated her opinions, the gentleness that belied his rugged exterior, all had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The door opened and Xavier entered, bringing with him the cool night air and the scents of hay and horses. He removed his hat and coat, hanging them by the door, then paused when he noticed her pensive expression. "Something troubling you?" he asked, moving to warm his hands by the fire. Rosalie smiled faintly. Not troubling exactly, just contemplating changes. She watched the flames dance for a moment before continuing. "The school board wants me to move into the teachers' quarters next Sunday after church." "So soon?" Xavier looked surprised, then carefully neutral. "Well, I suppose that makes sense. The new term starts Monday." "Yes." Rosalie searched his face, looking for, she wasn't sure what, some indication that he might miss her presence. "It's for the best. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Xavier sat in the chair opposite her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You haven't been an imposition, Rosalie, not at all." He hesitated, then added quietly, "In fact, it's been good having you here." Her heart quickened at his words and the way he looked at her, as if seeing something valuable, something worth protecting. "It's been good being here," she replied softly. "I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come along that day." "You would have found a way," Xavier said with certainty. "You're stronger than you know." "Perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to test that theory." Rosalie leaned forward slightly. "Xavier," a sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever she had been about to say. Xavier frowned, rising to his feet. "It's late for visitors." He moved to the door, one hand resting on his holstered gun as he opened it. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Evening, Matthews. Miss Harrington?" The sheriff nodded to Rosalie. "Sorry to disturb you, but there's trouble. Clayton escaped custody about an hour ago, overpowered one of my deputies when they brought him supper." Rosalie went cold with dread. Xavier's posture stiffened as he asked, "Any idea where he's headed?" "He was asking questions in town earlier about where you live, Matthews. One of the saloon girls heard him say he had unfinished business with his fiancé." The sheriff's worried gaze shifted to Rosalie. "I've got men searching, but I thought you should be warned. Clayton's dangerous when he's drunk, and he was ranting about revenge before he escaped." Xavier's jaw tightened. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff. We'll be on guard." After the sheriff left with a promise to return if they found any sign of Clayton, Xavier secured all the doors and windows. He brought his shotgun from the gun cabinet and checked it methodically. "You should try to rest," he told Rosalie. "I'll keep watch tonight." "I couldn't possibly sleep," she replied, hugging herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Do you think he'll really come here?" Xavier's expression was solemn. "I don't know, but if he does, he'll find I'm not as easy to overcome as a jail deputy." He sat beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could feel the reassuring warmth of him. "I won't let him hurt you again, Rosalie. I give you my word." She believed him. In the short time she'd known Xavier, he had proven himself to be a man who kept his promises. Still, fear curled in her stomach at the thought of Edward's vengeful rage. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I've brought danger to your home." Xavier shook his head firmly. "The only person at fault is Clayton. Men like him create their own trouble and blame everyone else for it." He covered her cold hands with one of his. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Rosalie looked down at their joined hands. then up at Xavier's face, the strong lines softened by firelight, the determination in his dark eyes. In that moment, she realized something that had been growing inside her since he'd lifted her onto his horse and promised her safety. Despite everything she'd been through, despite her plans for independence, she was falling in love with this quiet, honorable cowboy. The thought should have terrified her after her experience with Edward. Instead, it felt right as natural and inevitable as sunrise after the darkest night. The hours crept by. Xavier insisted Rosalie try to sleep on the sofa while he kept watch by the window, but every creak of the cabin and whisper of wind kept her alert. Near midnight, the sound of a horse approaching brought them both to full alertness. Xavier moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Single rider," he murmured. "Coming fast." He positioned himself by the door, shotgun ready. "Stay back behind the table," he instructed Rosalie. She nodded, heart pounding as she took shelter. The rider stopped outside. A moment of silence followed, then uneven footsteps on the porch. A slurred voice called out, "I know you're in there with him, Rosalie. Come out and face me like a woman, Edward." His voice sent ice through Rosalie's veins. "You're trespassing, Clayton," Xavier called through the door. "The sheriff's looking for you. Best turn yourself in before this gets worse." A harsh laugh was the only response, followed by the sound of glass breaking. The sharp smell of kerosene filled the air, and then came the unmistakable whoosh of flames igniting. He's setting fire to the porch. Rosalie gasped. Xavier's expression hardened. "Get your coat. We need to leave through the back." As they moved toward the rear of the cabin, a gunshot rang out, splintering wood near the back door. Edward had circled around, anticipating their escape route. Come out," he sang mockingly. "The fire's spreading, deputy. Soon you'll have no choice." Xavier pulled Rosalie close, speaking urgently in her ear. "There's a trapdoor to the root cellar in the pantry. Get down there. There's a small tunnel that leads out behind the barn. My father built it as an escape route during the early days when Indian raids were common. Follow it, then run for the trees. Mrs. Wilkins's place is 2 miles east." "What about you?" Rosalie clutched his arm. "I'll keep Clayton busy, give you time to get away." When she began to protest, he cupped her face gently. "Please, Rosalie, I can't focus on stopping him if I'm worried about you being caught in the crossfire." The genuine concern in his eyes silenced her arguments. Xavier led her quickly to the pantry and pulled back a rug to reveal the trapdoor. The smell of smoke was growing stronger as the fire spread from the porch to the cabin walls. As Rosalie prepared to descend into the dark cellar, she acted on impulse, rising on tiptoes to press a swift, fervent kiss to Xavier's lips. "Be careful," she whispered. "I couldn't bear to lose you now." Surprise and something deeper flashed in his eyes before he nodded. "Go. I'll find you when it's over." The root cellar was cool and dark, lit only by the thin beams of moonlight filtering through cracks in the trapdoor. Rosalie found the tunnel entrance where Xavier had described it, behind a stack of preserved food. The passage was narrow and low, forcing her to crouch as she made her way through the earthen corridor. Above, she could hear muffled shouting and another gunshot. Tears stung her eyes as she thought of Xavier facing Edward alone, with the cabin burning around them. But she kept moving, knowing the best way to help Xavier was to reach safety and bring back assistance. The tunnel emerged, as promised, in a small depression behind the barn, concealed by bushes. Rosalie crawled out, gulping the fresh night air. From this vantage point, she could see flames engulfing one side of the cabin. 2 figures struggled on the ground near the front porch. Xavier and Edward locked in a desperate fight. Every instinct screamed at her to run to Xavier's aid, but she knew she would be more hindrance than help. Gathering her courage, she turned toward the tree line as instructed. She had taken only a few steps when a scream of rage made her look back. Edward had broken free of Xavier's hold and was staggering to his feet, a knife glinting in his hand. Xavier lay motionless on the ground. "No." The word tore from Rosalie's throat before she could stop it. Edward's head snapped in her direction. A terrible smile spread across his face as he spotted her. "There you are," he snarled, lurching toward her. "Thought you could escape me again." Rosalie backed away, desperately searching for a weapon or means of escape. Her heels struck something solid, a pitchfork leaning against the side of the barn. She grabbed it, holding it before her like a spear. "Stay back, Edward," she warned, her voice steadier than she felt. He laughed, the sound chilling in its madness. "Going to fight me now, are you? Your cowboy couldn't stop me. What chance do you think you have?" "A better one than you might imagine," Rosalie replied, thinking of everything she'd learned about strength in the past weeks. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Edward's face contorted with fury. He lunged forward, knife raised. Rosalie braced herself, prepared to fight with everything she had. A shot rang out. Edward froze, a look of confusion crossing his features before he crumpled to the ground. Behind him stood Xavier, a smoking pistol in his hand, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He swayed slightly but remained upright through sheer determination. Rosalie dropped the pitchfork and ran to him, reaching him just as his knees buckled. She helped lower him gently to the ground, cradling his head in her lap. "You're alive," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Told you I'd keep you safe," Xavier murmured, managing a weak smile despite his obvious pain. "He caught me with a rock, knocked me out for a moment. Woke up just in time to see him going after you." In the distance, they could hear hoofbeats approaching, the sheriff and his men finally arriving. Rosalie bent over Xavier, brushing his hair back from the wound on his forehead. "You did keep me safe," she said softly. "From the moment you found me on that trail, you gave me more than safety, Xavier. You gave me hope again when I thought it was lost forever." His dark eyes held hers, filled with an emotion that made her heart swell. "Rosalie," he began, then winced as he tried to sit up. "SHH," she soothed, gently restraining him. "Rest now. Whatever needs saying can wait until you're healed." The sheriff and his deputies arrived moments later, taking charge of Edward's body and helping Xavier into the house. Miraculously, the fire had been confined to the porch and one outer wall, thanks to the night's damp air and the quick action of the lawmen, who immediately began a bucket brigade from the nearby stream. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed. The cabin was damaged but standing. Edward Clayton was dead, and Xavier, after being tended by the town doctor, was resting comfortably in his bed. The doctor had assured Rosalie that Xavier's head wound looked worse than it was, and that he would recover fully with proper care. "You should get some rest yourself, Miss Harrington," Sheriff Miller suggested as he prepared to leave. "It's been a long night for everyone." But Rosalie couldn't bring herself to leave Xavier's side. She sat in a chair beside his bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, reassuring herself that he was truly alive and on the mend. When his eyes finally fluttered open near noon, they immediately sought hers. "You're still here," he said hoarsely. "Of course I am." Rosalie moved to help him drink some water. "Where else would I be? Thought you might have reconsidered that teaching position," Xavier replied after drinking gratefully. "After all this trouble." "Is that what you want?" she asked carefully. "For me to take the teaching position and move to town?" Xavier was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "What I want," he finally said, "is for you to be happy and safe. If that means teaching in town, I'll understand. If it means something else." He took a breath. "Rosalie, I know it's too soon. After what you've been through, the last thing you need is another man making claims on your future, but I find myself hoping. That is, I've grown to care for you, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Rosalie's heart soared at his halting confession. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Some things don't need time to be certain." She took his hand in hers. "I care for you too, Xavier. These weeks with you have shown me what a good man truly is, not through words or promises, but through actions and character." Hope dawned in Xavier's eyes. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I don't want to move to town," Rosalie interrupted with a smile. "Not unless you come with me." Xavier returned her smile, raising their joined hands to press a kiss to her fingers. "I was thinking more along the lines of you staying here, permanently." His expression grew serious. "Not right away. Take the teaching position, live in town for a while if you need to. I can court you properly the way you deserve, but know that whenever you're ready, there's a place for you here with me." Tears of joy welled in Rosalie's eyes. "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, with the first wildflowers of spring blooming in the garden Rosalie had lovingly restored, they were married under the old oak tree beside the cabin. The entire town turned out for the celebration, including Rosalie's students from the school where she continued to teach 3 days a week. Mrs. Wilkins, who had become like a mother to them both, wept happy tears as she watched them exchange vows. Sheriff Miller stood as Xavier's best man, and the town's seamstress, who had become Rosalie's dear friend, served as her matron of honor. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after my parents died," Xavier told Rosalie as they danced beneath lanterns strung in the trees. "Certainly never expected to find it with a half-dead woman in the dust of a trail." Rosalie laughed, her eyes shining with love. "And I never imagined that being thrown from a stagecoach would lead me to the best man I've ever known." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for finding me that day." Xavier pulled her closer, dropping a kiss on her upturned face. "Thank you for being brave enough to trust again. I promise you'll never regret it." And as the stars emerged in the Wyoming sky, casting their silver light over the celebration, Rosalie knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't. From the ashes of betrayal had risen something true, and lasting a love forged in adversity and strengthened by shared values and mutual respect. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she'd set out for the West, but it was infinitely better than any she could have dreamed. In Xavier's arms, she had found not just safety, but home.